Hey, folks. Hey, it's December 15th, which is not only delivery day for 6:30 Chad Santa's Anonymous, but it's chapter 15 of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. So let's get into it, okay? Suddenly, the entire room disappeared, and they were standing out in the city street on Christmas morning. The houses in town looked dingy and dismal, yet there was a cheerful air about the people. They greeted each other happily. The Spirit led Scrooge straight to the house of his clerk, Bob Cratchit. The Spirit stopped at the threshold of the home and blessed it with a sprinkling of his torch. Mrs. Cratchit soon appeared, dressed in a poorly made frock, but she managed to do her best to dress it up with ribbons. Her daughter, Belinda, wore something similar. Peter Cratchit was wearing a shirt that belonged to his father, and it was much too big on him. Two younger Cratchit children came running through the room. "Where in the world is your father?" said Mrs. Cratchit, "and your brother, Tiny Tim?" "Here's Martha, Mother," cried the young Cratchits. "Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha. Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late are you?" said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her with zeal. "We'd a deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and had to clear away this morning, Mother." "Here comes Father," cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came Bob, the father, his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable. Tiny Tim sat upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he used a little crutch and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking around. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming," said Bob, with a sudden decline in his high spirits. "Not coming on Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, even if it were only a joke, so she came out from behind the closet door and ran into his arms. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire. The family sat down to enjoy their Christmas dinner. Although by most standards it was a meager meal to the Cratchit family, it was a feast fit for a king. As the dinner was ending, Bob rose from his place at the head of the table and proclaimed, "A Merry Christmas to all of us, my dears." "God bless us. God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "and a crutch without an owner carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no. Kind Spirit, say he will be spared." Scrooge hung his head and was overcome with grief. But he raised it again quickly when he heard his name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob. "To Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I'd hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, the children, it's Christmas Day." "I know it, but Mr. Scrooge is such a selfish fellow," said she. "My dear," said Bob's mild manner, "Christmas Day." "I'll toast to his health for your sake," and the day's, said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not for his. Long life to him. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt. To the children, Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. The Cratchit family continued to have a wonderful and merry feast, and by this time it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavily. Scrooge and the Spirit went back out along the streets. And that, folks, is chapter 15. Thank you for joining me. Join us tomorrow for chapter 16.